I was born into the Whitmore family name, and in our small town that meant something. From the moment I could walk, people whispered that I was destined to inherit the empire my grandfather built brick by brick, Whitmore and Sons Mercantile, the red-bricked cornerstone of Main Street. Everyone bought something from us. Farmers came for seed, mechanics for tools, mothers for flour and bolts of fabric. On Saturday mornings, the store bustled with life, laughter echoing under its tin ceiling, dust motes swirling like gold in the shafts of light from tall windows. To outsiders, it wasn't just a store. It was the beating heart of Whitmore Crossing. But to me, it was home. My grandfather's office smelled of pipe smoke and ledger ink, the shelves lined with rows of green account books that felt more sacred than any Bible. "Our name carries weight, child," he'd say, tapping one of those ledgers with his heavy finger. "But weight can crush a careless hand. Remember that." I was 12 then, still small enough to believe he meant me when he spoke of heirs. My father, however, made sure I never forgot my place. He told me Whitmore and Sons wasn't built for daughters. That I could learn the cash register, maybe the books, but the business itself, the ownership, the respect, belonged to my older brother, Daniel. He was only 3 years ahead of me, but in our father's eyes, Daniel might as well have been born a century wiser. Where my ideas were called childish, his were called vision. Where I was scolded for speaking out of turn, he was praised for his boldness. And yet, Daniel never loved the store the way I did. At 16, I was the one who stayed late to count inventory, who memorized which families were behind on credit and which farmers needed an extra sack of feed to make it through. I knew the rhythm of the town, the rise and fall of its fortunes, like the beat of my own pulse. Daniel? He preferred the county fair, the poker tables, and girls who liked his smile. The unfairness gnawed at me, but I swallowed it. In our house, defiance only bred harsher words. The night it all broke open, I was 19, home from the community college where I studied accounting. Supper had ended in the dining room, where the grandfather clock ticked between bursts of conversation. My father had asked Daniel about his plans for the store. Daniel leaned back in his chair, mouth full of roast, bragging about new products he'd thought to bring in fancy imported radios, even though half the town still struggled to pay for seed. My father beamed with pride. My mother nodded silently, her fork untouched. When the moment felt right, I gathered my courage. From my satchel, I drew out the papers I'd worked on all week. A plan, a way to balance the credit ledgers and cut losses without crushing the farmers who depended on us. If we trimmed certain accounts and reorganized others, we could save nearly 10%. I laid the papers across my father's plate. He read the first lines, then let out a sharp laugh. Not the gentle laugh of amusement, but the bark of a man swatting away a fly. "Books and numbers," he said. "Leave the thinking to your brother. You'd do better marrying someone who knows how to work." Daniel smirked. "Don't take it hard, sis. Some of us are born to run things, and some of us just aren't." My face burned, but I pressed on. "I know the store, Pa. I know this town. I'm the one who—" Enough. His hand slammed down, rattling the cutlery, silencing even the clock. "You are not the future of this business. Daniel is. Don't embarrass yourself with these little schemes again." I looked to my mother, hoping for a word, even a glance of defense. But she only twisted her napkin, eyes lowered, lips pressed tight. That night something cracked inside me. I left the dining room without another word. Main Street lay silent under the lamplight, the yellow glow spilling long shadows across the boarded cinema, the post office, the diner with its lone neon sign buzzing weakly in the dark. I swear the town itself watched me pass, as though it had witnessed my humiliation and now whispered about it behind closed shutters. Back at the house, I packed my suitcase in silence. The walls of my bedroom, once covered in sketches of the store's floor plan and maps of new trade routes, looked suddenly childish. I folded each dream away with my clothes. My mother stood in the doorway, hands still wringing. She didn't stop me, didn't comfort me, only whispered, "Don't make trouble for your father." That cut deeper than the dismissal itself. By midnight, I was at the bus depot. The benches smelled of dust and motor oil, and the clock above the ticket window ticked so loud it might have been counting down the end of my old life. When the Greyhound rumbled in, headlights sweeping across cracked pavement, I climbed aboard with my suitcase and the taste of ashes in my mouth. I swore then that I would never beg for a place at that desk again. If Whitmore and Sons didn't want me, then I would build something greater. I would learn the weight of money, of property, of power itself. And one day, I would make them look me in the eye as I turned the keys of their own empire in my hand. But as the bus pulled away and the town lights faded into the black countryside, I didn't yet know how far I'd have to go, nor how deep the betrayal of my own family would cut before I finally found the chance for revenge. And when that chance came, it would shake the very bones of Whitmore Crossing. The first months away from Whitmore Crossing tasted like rust and hunger. The city where the bus carried me was nothing like the narrow streets I had known. Its buildings leaned tall and gray over me, their windows glowing with a cold light that never felt welcoming. I rented a room above a laundromat, where the air smelled of soap and steam, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear my neighbor coughing through the night. My suitcase emptied fast. A few skirts, 2 blouses, a coat worn thin at the elbows. I found work where I could, first washing dishes in a diner that never seemed to close, later scrubbing floors in an office tower where no one ever bothered to learn my name. Every night, I came home with raw hands and a body that ached in places I didn't know could hurt. Sometimes, in those early weeks, I almost turned back. I pictured myself stepping off a bus into Whitmore Crossing, hat in hand, ready to apologize. But then I would hear again the sharp bark of my father's laugh, the smirk on Daniel's face, my mother's silence in the doorway. And the shame would turn to steel. I had left with little, but I had one thing still, my mind. Numbers had always been my comfort, the way other children found solace in music or prayers. I carried a small ledger with me everywhere, filling it with calculations, ideas, tiny experiments in making sense of debts and credits. It was a habit my grandfather had taught me. Put the truth on paper, child. Ink never lies. One evening, after a long shift at the diner, I sat hunched over that ledger at a corner table, my apron still damp. The manager, a broad man with more bark than patience, stopped at my table. He tapped the pages with one greasy finger. "You keep scribbling numbers like that, girl, folks gonna think you're cooking the books," he said, half amused, half suspicious. "Not cooking," I answered softly, not looking up. "Fixing." He laughed, but an older waitress leaned close later. "If you're good with numbers, there's a man on 7th who needs help. Runs a pawn shop. Can't keep his accounts straight. He pays cash." That tip changed everything. The pawn shop was dark and crowded, full of clocks that never struck the right hour and guitars with strings missing. Its owner, Mr. Klein, was weary-eyed and gruff, but desperate. His books were chaos, slips of paper stuffed in drawers, debts owed, loans forgotten. I spent 2 nights reorganizing, writing down every number, every name. By the end of the week, he called me back, this time with a stack of bills and the first honest respect I had been shown since leaving home. "You've got a head for this," he said. "Ever think about doing it proper?" That question lit something inside me. I scraped together tuition for night classes at the community college. Days were spent in the pawn shop, evenings in classrooms that smelled of chalk and sweat, nights spent over textbooks until dawn. Economics, finance, property law, words my father would have called useless, but which to me became tools, sharp and shining. It was not an easy climb. There were weeks I lived on bread and black coffee, weeks the laundromat downstairs carried me on credit. More than once I pawned my coat to pay for books, claiming it back only when Mr. Klein pitied me. But with every class, every exam, I felt myself rise. I was learning to see what my father never had, that power didn't come only from land or goods on a shelf. It came from owning what others needed most: money, property, leverage. Years passed in that rhythm. Work, study, exhaustion, and a hunger that went beyond food. By the time I turned 24, I had graduated with honors, a degree no Whitmore had ever imagined possible for me. I wore the borrowed gown with pride, though there was no family waiting in the crowd, no camera flashing my name. Only the sound of my own footsteps crossing the stage. But life is never a straight road. The same week I found a job as a junior clerk in a bank downtown. A letter arrived from Whitmore Crossing. The handwriting was familiar, my mother's, careful and slanted. I nearly tore it open right there in the street. Inside were only a few lines. Your grandfather has passed. The funeral is Saturday. Your father thinks it best you not attend. Do what you think is right. Mother. The world tilted under me. My grandfather, the one man who had believed in me, was gone. I held the letter until my hands shook, the ink smearing where my tears touched it. I wanted to go back, to stand by his grave. But the thought of facing my father's scorn and Daniel's smirk stopped me cold. I folded the letter once, twice, then slipped it into the pocket of my ledger. His voice echoed in my memory. Our name carries weight, child. Don't let it crush you. That night, I sat by the window of my rented room, the city buzzing below, and swore an oath to the darkness. If they thought me unworthy to stand among them, then I would rise above them. Higher than they could ever imagine. Higher until the day came when the weight of the Whitmore name bowed to me. And so began my climb into the world my father never respected, and my brother never understood. A world where revenge was measured not in anger, but in ownership. But destiny has a cruel sense of timing. For even as I was learning to shape my future, forces in Whitmore Crossing were shaping against me, weaving betrayals that would burn far deeper than my father's laughter ever had. The bank where I found work was nothing like Whitmore Sons, yet strangely familiar. Instead of sacks of flour and barrels of seed, its shelves were lined with ledgers and contracts. Instead of haggling farmers, clients came in with their hats in hand, speaking of mortgages, debts, and dreams. I began at the lowest desk, entering figures until my fingers cramped, but it didn't take long for the manager to notice. Numbers spoke to me as easily as breathing, and where others stumbled, I found patterns, solutions, balances. Miss Whitmore, he said one afternoon, peering over his spectacles at my neat columns, you have the makings of a fine officer here. Stick with us, and you might just run this place one day. The words stirred something fierce in me. To run a bank, to hold in my hands the keys to property, to business, to futures, that was a power my father never imagined, a power greater than any shelf in his store. But while my days filled with contracts and numbers, my nights were haunted by Whitmore Crossing. I could not escape it. Every time I counted an interest rate or balanced a loan, I thought of the farmers back home, crushed beneath debts my father refused to understand. And every so often, whispers of news drifted my way, carried by old neighbors who passed through the city, or a brief mention in the county paper. Daniel had taken more control of the store. My father, older now, let him handle the day-to-day. But Daniel's taste for risk had not faded. He brought in goods the town did not need: radios, novelty trinkets, shiny baubles, while shelves of feed and tools ran low. He extended reckless credit to those who flattered him, then cut off those who could not repay quickly enough. The Whitmore reputation, once as steady as the courthouse clock, began to tremble. At night I lay awake replaying memories. The counter where I had once stood with chalk-stained fingers, the shelves I had dusted as a girl, the creak of the office door where my grandfather smoked his pipe. I pictured Daniel behind that same counter, careless grin on his face, while townsfolk muttered outside about debts unpaid. My jaw clenched so tight it ached. I kept every scrap of news in a box beneath my bed. Old articles, gossip, even the names of merchants Daniel had quarreled with. I studied them as though preparing for an exam. Empires did not fall in a day. They crumbled slowly, one crack at a time. And I intended to be waiting when the walls gave way. Still, revenge was not yet within reach. I had to build something first. My first opportunity came during a foreclosure auction. The property, a sagging boarding house on the edge of the city. The courthouse hall smelled of sweat and ink, the auctioneer's gavel echoing like a pistol shot. The other clerks laughed at the place, calling it worthless. But I saw the numbers differently. Even in its ruin, with repairs, it could bring steady rent. When my turn came to bid, my voice shook, but I held it steady. I used every dollar I had saved, even borrowed against future wages, and signed the deed with trembling hands. That night, I sat alone in the dusty parlor, the smell of mildew thick, wallpaper curling from damp corners. To anyone else, it was a ruin. To me, it was proof that I could own, not just serve. The work nearly broke me. I scrubbed the walls until my knuckles bled, carried boards until my shoulders ached, bargained with carpenters who looked at me twice before agreeing to take orders from a young woman. There were nights I slept on the bare floor under my coat, listening to rats in the walls. But slowly, tenants filled the rooms. Rent trickled in. Then more. One house became 2, then 3. My ledger grew heavy with numbers that once belonged only to men like my father. At the bank, whispers followed me. Some said I was too ambitious, others that I must have a secret backer. I ignored them. The truth was simpler. I had hunger, and hunger is a sharper tool than wealth. Then, one evening, a letter came from Whitmore Crossing. Not from my mother this time, but from Clara, the sheriff's daughter. Her handwriting was hurried, blotched with ink. Your brother has been running the store wild. Credit stretched thin, shelves empty. Folks say the Whitmore name isn't what it once was. Your father still defends him, but there's talk. Some think the end is coming. I read the words until the candle guttered low. For the first time in years, the revenge I had sworn felt close enough to touch. But Clara's letter carried a warning too. At the bottom she had written, "Careful if you come back. Not everyone will welcome you. Some say your father told folks you abandoned us all." Abandoned. The word burned. I had not abandoned anyone, I had been cast out. Yet in their eyes, perhaps it was the same. The thought twisted in my chest like a blade. That night, sleep would not come. I walked the creaking halls of my boarding house, listening to the sound of tenants shifting in their beds, the city alive outside. I thought of Daniel swaggering behind the counter, of my father's barked laugh, of my mother's silence. I thought of Clara's warning. The dynasty was cracking. I could see it now, clear as day. But cracks alone would not bring the walls down. If I wanted revenge, true, quiet, undeniable revenge, I would need to be ready with more than anger. I would need to own enough, to hold enough, to strike at the moment when the Whitmore name was weakest. And that moment was coming. For already, rivals were circling. Clara mentioned a businessman from the next county who had sniffed around the store, asking if the family might sell. Others whispered about a supply chain company eager to plant itself on Main Street. They were waiting, watching, ready to pounce the moment the Whitmores faltered. If I did not move carefully, someone else would claim the spoils that should have been mine. By the time I turned 27, my ledger told a different story than the one my father had written for me. Where once there had been empty pages and debts, now there were deeds, mortgages, and contracts signed in my name. I had built something real, something solid, though no one in Whitmore Crossing knew it. To them, I was the daughter who had vanished, a rumor carried on buses and whispered about in pews on Sundays. But while I rose in the city, Daniel was dragging the Whitmore name into the dust. Clara's letters painted the picture in strokes both painful and inevitable. He borrowed against the store to fund schemes that pleased no one but himself. He filled the shelves with luxuries the town could not afford, let the grain bins sit empty, and gambled away the trust of farmers who had once relied on us. Credit lines were stretched thin, and tempers thinner. My father, too proud to admit his golden son was faltering, defended him at every turn. Just a rough patch, he told the townsfolk. The boy will find his footing. But the footing was already slipping. One letter chilled me more than the others. Clara wrote, "There's talk of foreclosure. A man from the city has been asking questions about buying the building. Folks say he represents a chain, one of those big supply outfits. If that happens, the Whitmore name will be gone from Main Street. Your father won't hear of it, but the papers are moving." The thought struck me like thunder. For all my father's cruelty, for all Daniel's smirks, the Whitmore name was part of me too. To see it handed to strangers, to lose it before I could claim it, was unthinkable. That night, I spread Clara's letters across my desk like a map. Alongside them, I placed the deeds to the houses and properties I now owned. Piece by piece, I saw the path. If the Whitmore dynasty was collapsing, I would not let it fall into another's hands. I would be there to catch it, even if they never saw me coming. But revenge, I reminded myself, could not be rushed. I began quietly. Through an associate at the bank, I learned which creditors Daniel had angered most. Some of those debts I bought in silence, using false names where needed. Every time I held another note in my hand, I felt closer to home. He thought he owed strangers in the city. In truth, he owed me. Yet danger lurked in that very silence. If Daniel discovered who held the strings, he would cry betrayal. My father would rage. And the town, already eager for gossip, would brand me cruel. I needed patience. I needed the cracks to widen until stepping in would look less like revenge and more like salvation. The moment came sooner than I expected. One autumn evening, Clara's letter arrived with hurried ink. Daniel lost near everything in a deal with the lumber mill. Father refuses to face it. They've mortgaged the Whitmore house itself to keep the store afloat. People whisper the sheriff may step in if creditors push harder. It's worse than ever before. If you mean to act, now is the time. I read those words under the dim glow of my boarding house lamp, my hands trembling. My childhood home, mortgaged to cover Daniel's folly. The rooms where I had studied ledgers late into the night, the walls that had held my shame, were now collateral on his recklessness. The image haunted me, my mother walking the hallways with a candle, her apron still tied at her waist, knowing every corner of the house was no longer hers. My father, too proud to speak of it aloud, locking the office door at night while his empire slipped through his fingers. Daniel laughing at a poker table while the family's foundation crumbled beneath him. That night, sleep did not come. I walked the streets of the city until dawn, the sound of my shoes on cobblestones like a drumbeat of memory. Each step carried me back to Main Street, to my father's laugh, to Daniel's smirk. The humiliation that had driven me onto that midnight bus still burned as though it were yesterday. And now, with the empire slipping, the moment I had sworn to live for was within reach. Yet one thought clung to me, heavy as iron. If I returned now, would they see me as savior or executioner? I could wait. Let the creditors take the store, let the Whitmore name be sold to strangers, and swoop in later to buy it cheap. Or I could reveal myself sooner, step out from the shadows, and lay my claim while the blood was still warm. The choice gnawed at me until my chest ached. At dawn, I sat at my desk, ledger open, pen in hand. Slowly, carefully, I wrote out a plan. The properties I could leverage, the debts I already held, the allies I could count on. Piece by piece, the picture formed. This was no longer about survival. This was about destiny. And in the silence of that gray morning, I knew I would not let strangers bury my family's name. If anyone was to lower it into the earth, it would be me, and when I raised it again, it would stand under my hand alone. But fate has its own timing. Just as I prepared to move, news reached me that a rival, a merchant from the next county, was already in talks with my father. He offered cash, quick and clean, the kind of lifeline desperate men take. If that deal closed, my chance at revenge might vanish forever. The clock was ticking, and I could no longer remain in the shadows. The letter from Clara lay folded in my coat pocket, as though it carried heat of its own. I touched it often, as though the ink might rub away if I didn't keep pressing it against me. A rival was circling. A merchant with cash in hand. My father, desperate, might agree to anything just to keep Daniel's ruin from showing in the daylight. If that deal closed, the Whitmore name would pass into another man's hands, and all my years of hunger would mean nothing. For the first time in nearly a decade, I packed a suitcase for Whitmore Crossing. The city air clung to me like soot, but my heart pounded with something sharp and restless, fear, yes, but also the thrill of returning not as a cast-out girl, but as a woman carrying secrets my family could not imagine. The train ride home was long and restless. Fields blurred past the windows, dotted with barns and scarecrows, and with every mile, the old rhythms of the town beat louder in my chest. I remembered how the church bell rang on Sundays, how the diners smelled of fried onions, how my grandfather's piped smoke curled through the store office. Memory and dread tangled until I could scarcely tell one from the other. When I stepped down at the small station, the air hit me like a ghost. Whitmore Crossing smelled of cut hay, coal smoke, and something else, something sour beneath it all, as though the town itself had grown tired. I lifted my suitcase and walked down Main Street, past faces that turned and whispered. Some recognized me, some only half remembered, but all stared as though I were a phantom returned from the grave. The store itself stood at the center, red brick now dulled with dust. Its windows were cloudy, its sign peeling. My father used to polish those windows until they shone like mirrors. Now they looked blind. I did not go inside. Not yet. Instead, I walked the street slowly, taking in the whispers, the sidelong glances, the feeling of a stage being set. The sheriff tipped his hat, more out of habit than warmth. The grocer's wife turned her back sharply. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked, "Is that her?" I caught the words as clear as bells. Her. The one who had left. The one who had abandoned them. At the boarding house that Clara's cousin kept, I rented a small room. She came to see me that night, her eyes wide, her voice a hurried whisper. "You picked the worst time to come back," she said. "Or maybe the best. Folks are restless. Your father won't admit it, but Daniel has near run the store to the ground. That merchant from Overton, name's Carter, he's pressing him for a sale. If he gets it, Whitmore and Sons will be gone before winter." "Then I can't wait," I answered. She studied me for a long time. "You left with nothing, and now you come back with a fire in your eyes. What are you planning?" I only smiled, though my hands trembled around the teacup she offered. "I'm planning to make things right." But in truth, it wasn't rightness I sought. It was retribution. The next morning, I walked into the bank on Main Street, the same one where my father had often drawn loans for seed and stock. The manager, an old man with spectacles slipping down his nose, blinked when he saw me. "By heaven," he muttered, "a Whitmore girl. Thought you were long gone." "I'm here on business," I said, laying down a folder thick with deeds and contracts. "And you'll find my accounts are stronger than any in this county." He opened the folder, lips pursed, and as his eyes widened, I felt the first flicker of power take root. He saw in black and white what my family never had, that I had built something greater than their dusty store, and I had the means to buy it out if need be. By noon, word had spread. Folks whispered in the diner, in the barber shop, even on the church steps. The lost daughter had returned, and she carried the smell of money with her. Some were suspicious, some envious, some quietly thrilled to see the balance shift. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, I walked past the store again. Through the glass, I saw my father hunched at the counter, hair silver now, shoulders bowed. Beside him, Daniel leaned back, laughing too loud at some joke, his boots on the ledger desk. The sight made my chest tighten. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, of walking through those doors, of seeing their faces when they realized what I had become. But standing there, I felt something colder. Time had stolen more than it had given. My father looked smaller, older, and yet his shadow still loomed. I turned away before they saw me. Revenge needed patience, and patience had carried me this far. But patience was running thin, and with Carter pressing, I knew the next move had to be mine. The town was waiting. My family was breaking. And the keys to their kingdom were closer than ever before. The day I finally stepped back into Whitmore and Sons, the bell above the door gave a weak, brittle jangle as though even it had grown tired. The air inside smelled of dust and stale coffee, nothing like the clean, polished scent I remembered when my grandfather ruled this place. Back then, the counters gleamed with oil, the shelves brimmed with sacks of flour stacked neat and high, and the floorboards shone from daily sweeping. Now, the counters were sticky with old spills, the glass jars of penny candy stood half empty and dulled with sugar frost, and farming tools leaned rusted against the wall as though no one cared enough to clean them. Even the old brass scale on the counter was missing one of its weights, as if balance itself had abandoned this place. My father looked up from behind the counter. His hair was silver now, his back stooped, but his eyes, sharp, cold, unyielding, had not softened. For a moment he did not speak. Then, in a voice dry as old paper, he said, "So it's true. The prodigal has returned." The office door swung open, and Daniel strode out with his boots thudding heavy on the boards. He grinned the same lazy grin he'd worn since boyhood, though now it had the edge of drink and arrogance. Well, he drawled. Look what the city dragged back. Thought you'd be too proud to show your face here again. I set my gloves on the counter carefully, like placing a card in a game no one else knew had begun. I came to see how the family business was faring. My father's lips thinned. Our affairs don't concern you. You left, remember? You made your choice. I remember, I said softly. And I also remember the laughter. My eyes met his until, for the first time, he looked away. Daniel smirked, rocking back on his heels. Still clinging to old grudges, sis? You should have learned by now the world doesn't hand things to women who sulk. You had your chance. I didn't sulk, I replied. I built. That silenced him for a beat. He blinked, the smirk faltering before returning with exaggerated bravado. From the back hallway came the sound of skirts brushing the floor. My mother appeared, apron still tied, hair pinned back in the same tight bun I remembered. Her face, thinner now, looked drawn from years of silence. She froze in the doorway, eyes widening at the sight of me. Her lips parted, but no words came. She simply wrung her hands, the way she had the night I left. Don't just stand there, Daniel barked at her, though his eyes never left me. She thinks she's got business here. She took a step forward, her voice a whisper. You shouldn't have come back. The word stung, though I had expected no less. Daniel slammed his palm on the counter. You're late, anyway. Carter was here yesterday. He's ready to pay. Once we sign, the Whitmore name stays alive, the shelves get stocked, and we're out of this mess. My father gave a curt nod, though his jaw twitched. It may be the only way. A sharp chill passed through me. The Whitmore name stays alive, Daniel said, but under another man's hand. Not ours. Not mine. What if there was another way? I asked. My father frowned. Don't speak in riddles. I've bought some of the debts against this place, I said. Not all. Not yet. But enough. Carter doesn't own your future, I do. The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Even my mother's breath caught in her throat. My father's jaw tightened. What game are you playing? No game. Just business. The kind you never let me learn here. I have properties, accounts, leverage you can't imagine. And if I chose, I could own this store outright before Carter steps back through that door. Daniel barked a laugh, too loud, too harsh. You? Own this store? Don't make me choke. Pa, don't listen to her. This is some trick. She's bluffing. But his laughter cracked when I opened my satchel and slid a sheaf of papers across the counter. Deeds, contracts, notes purchased quietly in the city. His face drained as he skimmed them, his grin collapsing into something raw. My father picked up one page slowly, his hands trembling just slightly. These are our creditors. His voice cracked like dry wood. You hold them. I do, I said simply. My mother let out a faint gasp, covering her mouth. For a moment, I thought I saw pride flicker in her eyes, quickly smothered by fear. Daniel shoved the papers back. You think you can just waltz in here and humiliate us? This is our store. My store. No, I said, my voice sharp as broken glass. It was grandfather's. Then father's. And you've squandered it. You mortgaged our house, Daniel. You dragged his legacy into the mud. You laugh and drink while the shelves go bare. If Carter buys this store, the Whitmore name dies. But if I take it, it lives. On my terms. My father's face was stone, unreadable, but his silence spoke louder than words. You'll never have it, Daniel spat. Not while I'm breathing. Then breathe carefully, I whispered. For the first time in years, my father looked at me not as a daughter, not as a burden, but as a rival. His eyes narrowed, cold and hard. If you mean to challenge us, you'd better be ready for the weight that comes with this name. I've carried that weight since the night you laughed me out of this store, I answered. Daniel slammed the office door behind him so hard the glass rattled. My mother flinched. My father remained still, his gaze locked on mine. Think carefully, girl, he said at last. You come for this place, you're not just fighting Carter. You're fighting blood. I know, I whispered. That's why it will hurt more when I win. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, footsteps paused against the storefront window, neighbors lingering, listening, waiting. The town knew a reckoning was near. News in a small town travels faster than fire in dry grass. By the time I walked out of the store that day, half of Whitmore Crossing already knew that I, the forgotten daughter, had returned with a ledger full of power and a claim on the Whitmore name. People gathered on porches as I passed, their conversations hushed, but their eyes sharp. Some nodded in quiet approval, others scowled as though I carried a curse. The air itself seemed charged, as though the whole town were waiting for thunder. At the barber shop, men leaned close over the morning paper, whispering that I had returned to pull the rug from under my own kin. At the mill, workers muttered during their lunch break, some saying it was high time someone stood up to Daniel, others swearing they'd never trust a woman who ran off and left her blood behind. At church, the whispers were worst of all, carried beneath stained glass windows, soft but sharp. Ambitious. Proud. Dangerous. The children repeated words they hardly understood: traitor, savior, thief, queen. That night at the diner, the talk was louder still. Old men stirred sugar into their coffee and speculated whether I meant to save the store or bury it. Housewives leaned across booths, sharing gossip as though it were communion bread. Teenagers stared at me from the corner, their eyes wide with the thrill of scandal. And Carter, the merchant from Overton, sat at the counter with his traveling case beside him, smiling like a man who enjoyed watching a fire spread. When I entered, his eyes caught mine. "Miss Whitmore," he said smoothly, tipping his hat. "I hear you've made things complicated." "Not complicated," I answered, sliding into a booth. "Correct." He chuckled, stirring his coffee. "Your father's desperate. Your brother's reckless. I came to offer a fair price and spare this town the drama. But it seems you'd rather stage a play." "This isn't a play," I said. "It's a reckoning." His smile thinned, but his voice stayed honey-sweet. "Be careful. Reckonings burn more than just the guilty." The room went still. Everyone listened. I left him there with his smile frozen, but the whispers followed me out into the night. The next morning, Daniel struck back. He stormed into the bank, demanding a loan to cover his debts. When the manager refused, citing the very notes I now held, Daniel shouted loud enough for the whole street to hear. "My sister's poisoning this town. She's not here to save us, she's here to destroy what little we've got left." By noon, whispers had become rumors and rumors had grown teeth. Some said I wanted revenge for old grudges. Others claimed I'd cheated men in the city to make my fortune. A few even whispered I had already struck a deal with Carter, playing both sides for my own gain. In Whitmore Crossing, truth mattered little, perception was its own weapon. That evening my mother came to see me. She sat stiffly in the chair of my rented room, her hands twisting her apron as though it might hold her together. The lamplight caught the silver in her hair, but her eyes were the same weary gray I remembered from childhood. "They're saying ugly things," she whispered. "About you. About me. About the whole family." "They've been saying ugly things since the night I left," I replied. Her voice cracked. "Your father doesn't sleep. He stares at your grandfather's portrait, as if waiting for it to speak. He thinks you've come back to finish what Daniel began, to kill what's left of him." I swallowed hard. "I came back because Daniel already killed it." She flinched, her fingers tightening on the apron. "Whatever he is, he's still your brother. And I am still his sister," I said. "But he never remembered that when he laughed me out of the store." She lowered her gaze, tears sliding down her face. "Why couldn't you have stayed gone? You might have found peace elsewhere." "Because peace isn't given," I said. "It's taken." Her sob was soft, and she rose without another word, leaving the chair rocking in her absence. Later that night, rocks struck my window, not one, but several. When I pulled back the curtain, I saw shadows scatter into the street, boys staring each other in the dark. On the boarding house door, someone had scrawled a single word in chalk: traitor. The feud was no longer private. It had become the town's entertainment. The next day Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, his voice carrying across the square. "She left us. She thinks she's better than us. Now she wants to own us." His face was red, his fists clenched, and his words curled through the crowd like smoke. Some cheered, eager to see a Whitmore man defend the name. Others murmured uneasily, remembering their own debts, their empty shelves. I stood in the shadows of the square, listening. I did not answer him. Not yet. Instead, I moved quietly. I met with creditors in back rooms, farmers in barns, shopkeepers in their shuttered stores. I listened to their troubles, their anger at Daniel. One by one, I offered terms better than Carter's, better than Daniel's false promises. Some shook their heads suspicious, but others gripped my hand as though I had pulled them from a river. Carter noticed. He dropped his prices, pressed harder, trying to force a deal before the tide turned fully against him. The town split down the middle, some swearing by him, some whispering my name with cautious hope, others cursing it in fear. Through it all, my father said nothing. He sat behind the counter like a statue, letting Daniel rage, letting rumors spread. But his eyes followed me whenever I passed, cold and unreadable, as though measuring just how far his daughter would go. On the 7th night after my return, Clara pounded on my door, breathless. "They're meeting at the store," she said. "Your father, Daniel, Carter, and half the town's leaders. They mean to decide the store's fate tonight." My heart thudded like a drum. This was the moment I had carried for years, every debt purchased, every deed signed. Every night I had sworn to see this through. I took my ledger from the desk, tucked it under my arm, and followed her into the dark. The fire had spread as far as it could. Tonight, it would either consume everything or clear the ground for something new. Clara's lantern swung in the dark as we hurried through the narrow streets. Whitmore Crossing was hushed, yet restless. Curtains twitched though no lamps burned behind them, and shutters creaked as unseen hands pulled them tighter. The air carried that strange, breathless stillness that comes before a storm. Even the dogs, who normally barked at every shadow, kept quiet. It felt as though the whole town was awake and listening, waiting to hear the verdict that would decide whether the Whitmore name lived or died. The store glowed like a furnace at the center of Main Street. Lamps blazed in every window, throwing long, trembling shadows across the boards outside. A crowd had already gathered, men lingering in the alley, women standing in the dark doorway of the diner, boys perched on the steps of the post office. None dared come closer, but all leaned forward as though the very walls of Whitmore and Sons might crack and let them hear the words spoken inside. The front door stood ajar. From within came the low thunder of voices, sharp one moment, muffled the next. Clara touched my arm once, her fingers trembling. "They won't welcome you," she whispered. "I'm not here to be welcomed," I said, and stepped inside. The bell gave a thin, weak jangle. The room fell silent. Around the counter stood the town's elders, the sheriff with his hat clutched in both hands, the banker with his spectacles gleaming, the grocer pale and sweating, the mill owner leaning against a post like a man prepared for a fight. My father sat at the desk, shoulders rigid, his face carved from stone. Daniel prowled near the stove, restless as a chained dog, his eyes glittering with drink. And leaning with polished ease against a barrel of nails was Carter, his city suit out of place among the scuffed boots and patched jackets, his smile as smooth as butter left too long in the sun. "Well," Carter said, breaking the silence with practiced charm, "the lost Whitmore graces us at last. I wondered if you'd come to watch your kin hand me the keys." Daniel's laugh was sharp, cruel. "She's here to gloat. Don't waste your breath." But my father's eyes, dark, searching, never left my face. I placed my ledger on the counter with deliberate care. The thump echoed in the stillness like the strike of a gavel. "I came because this decision doesn't belong to Carter. And it doesn't belong to Daniel either. It belongs to this town. And whether you like it or not, I have a voice in it." The sheriff shifted uneasily. "We're here to settle debts, Miss Whitmore. Not to stir up quarrels." "Debts." I opened the ledger. The pages crackled like fire. "Most of the debts you speak of are mine already. Notes you signed, accounts you thought tied to this store, they belong to me." Gasps rippled through the room. The grocer's hand went to his mouth. The mill owner muttered something under his breath. Even the banker leaned in, lips pursed, studying the papers with growing alarm. For the first time that night, Carter's smile faltered. Daniel barked a laugh, brittle as glass. "Lies. She's bluffing." "Then read." I slid a stack of documents across the counter. Every signature. Every figure. Bought fair and legal. Carter can wave his gold all he likes, but he can't buy what I already own. The sheriff bent over the pages, lips moving as he read. The grocer leaned closer, paling as he saw his own name among the debts. Murmurs spread like ripples on a pond. "You've been plotting," my father said finally, his voice low, dangerous. "I've been building," I answered. Daniel snatched up a page, his eyes darting furiously. His face drained, then reddened as though the words themselves had slapped him. He hurled the paper back. "You think this makes you clever? You're no savior. You're a vulture feeding off your own kin. Kin doesn't gamble away the family's future," I shot back. "Kin doesn't mortgage the house to cover his debts. You dragged this name into the mud, Daniel." I only picked it up. The banker cleared his throat, his voice measured but strained. "These documents appear binding. Carter's offer no longer stands alone. The choice is between his cash and her leverage." Carter pushed off the barrel, his smile snapping back into place like a mask. "Don't be fooled. She's dangling paper. I'm offering coin you can hold in your hand. When your shelves are bare and your bellies are empty, will ink feed you? Or will my gold?" The room murmured. The mill owner nodded grimly at Carter's words. The grocer looked torn in two. Even the sheriff's eyes flicked between us, measuring the balance. I felt the tide slipping. So I laid down my last card. From my satchel, I drew a letter sealed with the bank's crest. I held it high before setting it flat on the counter. "This," I said, "is an approved line of credit in my name. Enough to restock the shelves tomorrow. Enough to pay wages through winter. Enough to keep this store alive without selling it to strangers." The hush that followed was heavier than thunder. Carter's mask cracked. "You've set this up," he spat. "Waited like a spider in its web." "Better a spider than a fly," I said. The sheriff shifted, uneasy. "Seems the town has two paths. Carter's coin or her ink." And then, as one, every face turned to my father. He had been silent all along, staring at the ledger as though it were a serpent coiled before him. His knuckles were white where they gripped the desk, his breathing slow and ragged. The lines of his face had deepened, his mouth drawn tight. Daniel fumed beside him, fists clenched, but his father's silence pressed heavier than all his shouting. At last, my father spoke. His voice was gravel. "This store was built by my father's hands. It carried our name through harvests and drought, through prosperity and ruin. Now I see my son bleeding it dry and my daughter holding its debts." His eyes lifted to mine, sharp as a blade. "If I give it to you, do you mean to save it, or bury us with it?" Every man in the room leaned forward. The sheriff held his breath. The banker's pen hovered above his ledger. The grocer whispered a prayer. I met my father's gaze. "Neither. I mean to claim it." The words hung like smoke. Daniel cursed, slamming his fist on the counter. Carter's face darkened, his smile gone. The room erupted in argument, voices overlapping, the sheriff shouting for order, the banker demanding calm. My father did not move. He sat staring at me as though the years between us had never passed, as though all the weight of the Whitmore name balanced on that one sentence. And outside, beyond the glowing windows, the townsfolk pressed closer, waiting, listening. The fate of Whitmore Crossing itself hung in the balance. The store erupted. Voices overlapped, men shouting over one another until the sound became a roar. The sheriff banged his hand against the counter, trying to restore order. The banker scribbled furiously, as though recording history itself. The grocer muttered prayers under his breath. And through it all, Carter's voice cut smooth and sharp, like a knife through cloth. "Do you hear her?" he cried above the noise. "She admits it plain, she doesn't come to save you, she comes to claim you. Every debt, every coin, every hand that feeds this store will answer to her, not you. You trade one tyrant for another, only this time she bears your own name." A rumble of agreement passed through some of the men. Others shook their heads, unwilling to side with him openly. The mill owner growled, "At least her blood's from here, not Overton." Carter's eyes flashed, but his smile returned. "Blood doesn't fill bins. Blood doesn't put bread on tables. My money does." Daniel slammed his fist on the desk, the sound cracking like gunfire. "And my blood runs this store," he shouted. "Not hers. Not ever." He snatched one of the documents from the pile and ripped it in half, the paper shrieking as it tore. The room gasped. "Those are legal contracts," the banker barked. "You can't tear away signatures with temper." Daniel's eyes were wild, unfocused. "She's tricked you all. She's no Whitmore. She's a thief hiding behind our name." I stepped forward, my voice cutting through his frenzy. "You speak of Whitmore pride while you pawn the very house we grew up in. You speak of blood while you bleed this town dry. You speak of family while you laughed as father cast me out. You've had your chance, Daniel. And you squandered it." His face twisted, red and shaking. "I'll see you ruined before I let you have it." He lunged across the counter, his hand snatching for my ledger. For a heartbeat, chaos froze into stillness. Then the sheriff moved, grabbing Daniel by the arm, yanking him back. The ledger thudded safely against my chest, my fingers clutching it tight. "Enough," the sheriff thundered. "This isn't a brawl in the street. This is the fate of Whitmore Crossing." But Daniel fought against him, spitting curses. "She's poison. She'll kill us all." Carter seized the moment. He stepped forward, hands raised in feigned calm. "See how divided they are? Father against daughter, brother against sister. Do you really want this chaos to guide your future? My offer is simple, my gold clean. End this circus now." The room wavered. The grocer nodded weakly. The banker hesitated. Even the sheriff's grip faltered on Daniel's arm. I knew I had only one chance left. Slowly, I lifted the ledger high so all could see. "This book holds every figure," I said. "Every debt, every credit, every name. My grandfather taught me to keep it true, because ink does not lie. Tonight you've heard Carter's gold, Daniel's rage, Father's silence. But here," I struck the ledger with my hand, the sound echoing like a drum. "Here lies the truth. This store is mine already. Not by force. Not by trickery. By law, by work, by patience you all refused me." A hush swept the room. Even Carter's smile froze. My father rose slowly from his chair. He looked older than I had ever seen him, his shoulders sagging, his face pale. For a moment, I thought he might side with Carter, might crush me with one final refusal. But his gaze swept the torn papers, the shouting men, the fury of his son, and finally settled on me. "You've carried this grudge for years," he said, his voice rough. "I hear it in every word. But grudge or not, you've done what none of us would. You've been patient. You've been ruthless. You've been a Whitmore in ways I never imagined." Daniel choked. "Pa, you can't." My father silenced him with a raised hand. "This is no longer your choice." The air seemed to shift. The banker lowered his pen. The grocer stared at the floor. Even Carter stiffened, sensing the tide turning. Then my father turned to me, his eyes colder than the grave. "But know this, if you take it, if you put your name above ours, it will not be out of love. It will be out of victory. And victories carry enemies." I met his gaze, steady. "I've lived with enemies all my life." The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Outside, the crowd pressed closer, shadows gathering against the windows. The fire had reached its peak. One word from my father, and the dynasty would pass to me. One more outburst from Daniel, and the night could end in ruin. The store was no longer just a building. It was a battlefield, and the battle was about to break. The air in the store was so heavy it seemed the lamps themselves flickered under the weight. My father's words still hung between us, rough and final. I had won, but victory would not come without enemies. Daniel's face twisted red with fury. "You can't just hand it to her. After all I've done." "All you've done," my father cut him off, "is ruin what was given to you. Enough." His voice cracked like a whip, sharper than I had ever heard. For the first time, Daniel shrank beneath it. But Carter was not so easily silenced. He stepped forward, hat in hand, his voice rising smooth and urgent. "Gentlemen, don't be fooled by this display. Yes, she holds paper, but paper burns. I hold coin. Hard, clean coin that can fill your shelves tomorrow. Why cling to pride when survival is at stake?" Murmurs rippled again. The grocer shifted uneasily. The banker licked his lips. Even the sheriff glanced toward me as though waiting for proof stronger than words. So I opened the ledger one final time and read aloud. Every debt, every note, every name Carter thought he could buy already in my hand. My voice rang against the shelves, steady as iron. With each page, the murmurs died. With each figure, Carter's smile cracked further until nothing remained but his clenched jaw. At last, the banker spoke. It's done. Legally, she holds the reins. No amount of Carter's coin can undo that. The sheriff nodded. Then let it stand. The store is hers. Outside, the crowd stirred, sensing the shift. Word would spread before dawn. The black sheep had returned not as a beggar, but as the master of Whitmore and Sons. Daniel roared, lunging again, but the sheriff held him back. His voice broke with rage. You think this town will follow you? They'll spit on your name. You'll never be one of us again. I looked at him, and for the first time, felt no sting. I don't need to be one of you. I only need to be myself. Carter slammed his hat onto his head, his voice dripping venom. This town will regret this day. When her ledgers fail, when her promises turn to dust, you'll all come crawling back. He turned on his heel, his polished boots striking the floor like gunshots as he stormed out into the night. Silence followed, broken only by the sound of Daniel's ragged breathing. My father lowered himself back into his chair, old and weary, his eyes dull now that the fight was gone. For years I had dreamed of this moment, his defeat, his acknowledgement. Yet standing there, ledger clutched to my chest, I felt only a strange, hollow calm. The meeting broke slowly, the men filing out into the cool night. Some nodded to me with reluctant respect, others avoided my gaze. The sheriff tipped his hat, grim and tired. When the door finally closed, only the three of us remained, my father, my mother silent in the doorway, and me. You've claimed it, my father said, his voice a whisper of gravel. It's yours now. But know this, it will never love you back. I don't need love, I said. I need legacy. He closed his eyes as though too tired to argue. My mother's lips trembled, but no words came. I left them there, in the dim light of the store that was no longer theirs. Outside, the crowd parted in silence as I stepped into the street. The night smelled of smoke and damp earth, of endings and beginnings. Children clutched their mother's skirts, men tugged their hats low. No one cheered, but no one jeered either. The weight of my victory pressed down on them all. In the days that followed, Carter vanished from town, his promises carried off like smoke on the wind. Daniel raged, drank, and finally left too, trailing bitterness in his wake. My father lingered behind the counter for a while, his hands resting on the wood as if it might still answer to him. But each day it answered less until he stopped coming at all. And me? I worked. I restocked shelves, hired staff, mended what was broken. Slowly, the town's eyes shifted. Suspicion softened into grudging respect. Debtors found my terms kinder than Carter's had been, stricter than Daniel's lies, but fair. Farmers shook my hand. Mothers trusted me with their coins. Whitmore and Sons breathed again. One evening, I stood alone in the office where my grandfather once smoked his pipe. The ledgers lined the shelves, old and new, each page a story of survival. I opened mine, the fresh ink glowing under lamplight. At the top of the page, I wrote the words I had longed to write since the night I left this town. Whitmore and daughters. For a moment, I let the ink dry, my chest tight. Then I closed the book and set it on the shelf among the others. Revenge had carried me home, but legacy would keep me here.